Some bridges don't burn in one moment. They wear away quietly, year after year, under the weight of everything nobody said out loud, until the day you look down and realize there was never solid ground beneath you at all. That day came from Marisol Thackeray on a Tuesday afternoon, in a kitchen she'd cooked 10,000 meals in. She placed a single piece of paper on the table between her and her husband of 12 years. "Explain this to me," she said, "the way you'd explain it to a jury." Desmond Ashworth looked down at the paper, and then his face did something Marisol had never seen in 12 years of marriage. It emptied out completely, like a man watching the foundation give way under a building he'd spent years reinforcing. He didn't answer. He couldn't, because there was no version of the truth that didn't end them. If you're new here, welcome to Earned Love, and if you've been with us before, hit subscribe, because this one earns its ending. That single piece of paper was about to end a 12-year marriage in one afternoon. Maybe you felt it too, trusting someone with everything, only to learn later that you never had the full picture. That's what happened to Marisol. She built her entire adult life around a story her husband told her once, 12 years ago, and never corrected. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that story hid, and exactly what it cost him. To understand how she got there, you have to go back to the beginning, to a woman who believed in showing up. That was who she was. Steady, warm, the kind of person who opened her door before she thought to ask questions. She remembered the night clearly. Late autumn, the porch light flickering, Desmond standing on her doorstep with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a sleeping 4-year-old over the other. His voice cracked when he told her what happened. His brother and sister-in-law, gone in a car accident upstate. No other family willing to step in. The boy, Silas, had no one left. "Except us," Desmond had said. She never asked to see a death certificate. She never asked for paperwork. She simply opened her arms, because the man asking her to do this was the man she loved, and because a frightened 4-year-old boy needed somewhere soft to land. The years that followed built themselves quietly, the way real life does. First words, skinned knees, school plays where Marisol sat in the front row, alone, because Desmond was closing a deal or prepping a deposition. She never resented it. Not really. She told herself that ambition had a cost, and that cost was late nights and missed dinners, and she paid it willingly because she believed in what they were building together. Desmond climbed fast. Junior associate to senior counsel in under a decade, then whispers of a partnership vote on the horizon. Every promotion came with longer hours, closed office doors, a phone he kept face down on the nightstand. She noticed. She just never let herself ask why a man building a family would work like a man running from one. Silas called him Uncle at every birthday, every school function, every bedtime story Desmond was too tired to finish. And Marisol watched the two of them together. This boy who lit up any time Desmond walked into a room and felt something she mistook for certainty. She thought she'd earned the right to that certainty. She hadn't. It happened on an ordinary Saturday. Marisol was gathering laundry from Silas's room, pulling sheets from his bed, when she noticed a folded corner of paper wedged behind his desk, pressed into the narrow gap where the wood met the wall. The kind of place a document ends up when someone wants it kept, not seen. She almost left it there. Whatever instinct made her reach for it instead, she couldn't later explain. The envelope was old, the paper inside brittle at the folds, yellowed with age in a way that told her it had been hidden for years, not months. She unfolded it carefully, expecting nothing. A forgotten school form maybe, or an old permission slip. It was a hospital record, a maternity ward, in a state she didn't recognize, dated the year Silas was born. Her eyes moved down the page, out of habit more than curiosity, until they reached a small box near the bottom. 2 words printed above it, parent, father, and beneath that, typed in plain, unremarkable ink, a name she knew better than her own. Desmond Ashworth, not uncle, not guardian. Father. Marisol read it 3 times, certain each time that she'd misunderstood something simple, but the letters didn't rearrange themselves into anything else. They stayed exactly what they were. She sat down on the edge of Silas's bed, the record trembling slightly in her hands, and did the math her mind didn't want to do out loud. Silas had never had parents who died upstate. Silas had a father who'd been lying beside her every night for over a decade, calling him nephew without so much as a flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't call out for him. She just sat there, perfectly still, holding an entire marriage in one shaking hand, and understood, before she'd said a single word to anyone, that nothing about her marriage would survive what she'd just read. In that instant, Marisol found herself doing the one kind of arithmetic no one ever wants to do, replaying an entire marriage in her head, wondering how much of it had been real. Maybe you've had that moment too. The one where a single fact forces you to re-examine everything that came before it. Every warm memory suddenly viewed through a different lens, every certainty quietly renegotiated. That's the particular cruelty of ambition when it's paired with deception. It doesn't just cost the person chasing it. It costs everyone who trusted them enough not to ask questions. Before Marisol confronted Desmond, she needed to understand exactly how far back this went, how long he'd been building a version of their life that was never true. What she found next would explain everything. Stay with me, because the full history is coming up, and it's worse than you think. Marisol didn't move for a long time. When she finally did, it wasn't to confront him. Not yet. It was to think. She thought about the early years of the marriage, how Desmond had climbed from junior associate to senior counsel in less time than most attorneys make partner. She'd always framed it as drive. Now she wondered if it had been something closer to running. The late nights, the closed office door, the phone he kept face down, every single time, without fail. She'd built a comfortable explanation for each one: ambition, pressure, the cost of building something. She'd never once considered that the explanation might be a cover for something else entirely. By the time Desmond came home that evening, she was sitting at the kitchen table, the hospital record placed neatly in the center, facing him. She didn't raise her voice. She simply asked him to account for it, plainly and precisely, as if he were standing before a jury, because she wanted to know exactly how good a liar he really was. Something in his expression gave way completely. And then, slowly, painfully, the truth came. Not all at once, but in pieces, the way guilty men always tell it, hoping each fragment will feel small enough to survive on its own.
There's something I have to tell you. I know this changes everything, but I couldn't keep it from you any longer.
There had been a woman, he admitted, years before Marisol, during the hardest stretch of his career, when he was working 19-hour days and barely remembered his own name, let alone anyone else's. She'd gotten pregnant. She hadn't wanted to raise a child alone, and Desmond, terrified of what a scandal would do to a career he'd bled for, had quietly paid her to disappear, agreeing to take the boy himself once she decided, 2 years later, that motherhood wasn't for her. The accident story, he confessed, had been invented because the truth would have ended things between him and Marisol before they'd even begun. "I was going to tell you," he said. "When?" she asked. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a verdict. He had no answer. There had never been a plan, only the daily, cowardly choice to say nothing, repeated for over a decade, until one wedged piece of paper did what he never had the courage to do himself. But here's the part that turns this from a broken marriage into something far more calculated. The lie itself wasn't the worst of it. Some betrayals happen in a weak moment, a lapse, a mistake made under pressure. This wasn't that. What Marisol was about to discover wasn't a moment of poor judgment. It was a plan, built deliberately and maintained on purpose for over a decade. Because Desmond hadn't just hidden the truth from his wife. He'd used his skills as an attorney to protect himself, permanently, at a cost neither Marisol nor Silas ever knew they were paying. If you think you already know how far he went to guard his career, you're about to find out you're wrong. The paper trail was still out there, and Marisol was already looking for it. Marisol didn't confront Desmond again, not yet. She went looking for the one person who could confirm everything he'd told her, or expose what he hadn't. It took weeks of careful digging through old records, half-remembered names, and a private investigator Marisol paid for out of an account Desmond didn't know she'd kept. Eventually, she found her, Silas's biological mother, living quietly in another state, remarried, with a life that had nothing to do with the one she'd left behind over a decade earlier. The woman didn't deny anything. She confirmed the pregnancy, the payment, the agreement to walk away. But what she said next was the piece Marisol hadn't been prepared for. She'd never signed away her parental rights. Not officially. Desmond had told her it wasn't necessary, that he'd handle the paperwork himself. Marisol pulled every filing connected to Silas's guardianship, going back to the year he'd arrived in their home. What she found wasn't sloppy. It was precise. Desmond had drafted and filed guardianship documents years earlier that never named him as the father at all. Legal paperwork built specifically to secure custody of his own son, while shielding himself from any paternity claim that could surface during his partnership review. It wasn't a secret kept out of fear. It was a structure engineered by a man who understood exactly how the law worked and used that understanding to protect his career instead of telling the truth. Marisol sat with that for a long moment. This wasn't just a marriage built on a lie anymore. It was fraud. Quiet, technical, deniable fraud. The kind constructed by someone who believed ambition excused any shortcut, as long as no one ever found the seams. She thought about calling a reporter. She thought about how easily this story could become a spectacle. Desmond's name dragged through headlines, his career destroyed in public, humiliation instead of accountability. She didn't want spectacle. She wanted the truth handled the way Desmond himself would have handled it, if the situation were reversed. So Marisol picked up the phone and called a lawyer. The firm that had spent years grooming Desmond for partnership was about to learn exactly what its golden name had really signed. There's a particular satisfaction in watching consequences finally catch up to someone who spent years convinced they'd outrun them. Maybe you've waited for that moment yourself, the point where someone's carefully built reputation finally meets the truth they buried it under. But before we get there, understand what this cost. Not just Desmond. Years of silence don't stay contained to one person. It reaches a son who trusted the wrong version of his own story. It reaches a marriage that can't be unlived. What's coming next is justice. Real, documented, unavoidable justice. But I need you to understand something first. Justice and healing are not the same thing. And what happens next will prove exactly why. The custody proceedings that followed weren't loud. There were no headlines, no cameras outside a courthouse. Marisol had made sure of that. But the absence of noise didn't mean the outcome was gentle. Once the falsified guardianship filings were placed in front of a judge, the result was never in question. Full legal guardianship transferred to Marisol, uncontested. Desmond didn't fight it. There was nothing left to fight with. The paperwork he'd once used to protect himself had become the exact evidence that ended any claim he had left. At the firm, word moved differently, but it moved just as decisively. An internal inquiry opened into the guardianship documents bearing Desmond's signature. The partnership vote scheduled that spring never happened for him. It happened for someone else, in a room he used to believe he owned. He didn't lose everything overnight. He lost it exactly the way he'd built the lie, piece by piece, until there was nothing left standing. Silas was 16 by then, old enough to understand most of what had happened. Nobody forced him to choose. He simply did. He stayed with Marisol, not because she'd given him his blood, because she'd never once given him a version of himself that wasn't true. Desmond kept his distance for a while after that, unsure what he was even allowed to ask for anymore. When he finally worked up the courage to reach out, it wasn't about the firm, or the guardianship, or any of it. It was about the only thing he had left to lose. Whether there was any version of this where he and Marisol found their way back to each other, he asked her one last question. Most of us want to believe that enough time, enough remorse, enough good intentions can eventually undo even the worst damage. It's a comforting idea, that love, given enough patience, can repair anything. Desmond was counting on that idea being true. Marisol was about to prove him wrong. Her answer is the moment this stops being a story about a broken marriage and becomes the lesson you came here for. You don't want to miss what she said next. Desmond finally asked it, quietly, almost afraid of the answer. Was there any version of this where they found their way back to each other? Marisol looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger, something closer to grief. I raised your son believing he was someone else's loss, she said. You let me love him for over a decade without ever telling me who I was really loving him for. That's not the kind of thing two people rebuild. That's the kind of thing you carry alone for the rest of your life and call it what it is. She didn't wish him ruin. She simply stopped waiting for an apology large enough to match what he'd taken. Because some bridges don't burn in a single dramatic moment. They wear away quietly, year after year, under the weight of everything left unsaid, until the day someone finally looks down and realizes there was never solid ground beneath them at all. Justice found Desmond. It just never found its way back to her heart. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Earned Love, because the next one earns its ending too.